So Vinodh, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Can I maybe kick off by you giving us a sense of how you support the leasing industry, the type of work you work with, and the type of clients you support?
Sure. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Airline Economics as well. I run a group called the Structured Credit Group at Mizuho Americas. We've been there for about 10 years, and primarily finance esoteric assets through structured debt and equity, which includes securitization. So in the aviation space, a lot of what we've been doing is asset M&A, because we largely help lessors trade portfolios to financial investors with ABS leverage and E-notes from time to time. But as a function of that, we've raised capital for lessor platforms, and we've been sourcing equity from different parts of the world. We've sourced equity out of Korea, for example, and worked with clients in Japan, et cetera.
If we maybe start with the macro picture, and I'd be interested in your perspective on the strength of the leasing market here. We're sitting here in October 2025. Where are lessors at, and your perspective on the market?
Well, I think it's a very positive time to be an aircraft lessor. You have the lease rates that have climbed up since the dramatic rate hikes in 2022. It's been 3 years. Rates have come down a little in terms of interest rates. They're kind of coming back to where the increase in lease rates and the reduction in interest rates are kind of getting balanced out. So that's always a good spot to be in. You've also got the extremely dire situation of OEM supply issues where there's still a dearth of like 5,500 aircraft that should have been produced, which were not produced. And playing catch up is still going to take a while. So, I don't think that catches up to like the early 2030s. So if you're a lessor who's got aircraft, they're in great demand. The fourth point, I guess, would be that demand has come back to well over where we were in 2019 pre-COVID. So all of those are great signs for the aircraft leasing community.
And the investors within that community, are you seeing shifts within those investors? Are there new people coming in, new capital coming in, non-traditional investors potentially? And maybe the other side of that, are there some investors who are exiting this market?
It's a great question. I think I'll answer it slightly differently. I think if you go back to the aircraft leasing sector 20 years ago, 10 years ago even, it was more of a cottage industry. You had very few aircraft lessors that were investment grade. There was one, I think, at that point, that were where there was an investor following on the debt side in terms of like unsecured debt. There was also all kinds of different mom and pop type equity that was coming into the sector. I think that's all been largely cleaned up. You've got a number of larger aircraft lessors that access the unsecured market that are investment grade, who access institutional investors on the debt side. And then the equity side, we've seen a lot of private equity that's come in even way before pre-COVID. But post-COVID as well, we're seeing infrastructure funds come into the space. We're seeing insurance capital, which has come in and out from time to time. We're seeing capital from other parts of the world, Middle East, for example, which historically have always supported just their airlines, but now there are multiple aircraft leasing platforms in that region. You've always had Asian aircraft lessors, and there's been equity capital that's come in from all those regions as well. So I think there's a firmer base in terms of institutional support as well as equity support to the sector.
Okay, and when you look at it internally, Mizuho, and look at aircraft and speak to your colleagues, aircraft versus other asset classes, how do aircraft now compare? How are they viewed?
It's a great question. I think there was a period when COVID hit and there was a global shutdown, which has never happened before with this many aircraft out there, right? In the 20s, we weren't really flying that many planes. It went through a period where it was tested significantly, but I think coming out the other side, you've seen that it's a very resilient sector, and aircraft lessors have performed exceedingly well. They've all recovered. Largely the aircraft that were, deferred from a payment standpoint from airlines. They've all survived through it without having significant losses. They've all maintained their investment grade rating for the investment grade guys and come out on the other side. So I think it's an asset class that within banks is viewed as very resilient, very strong. I think from a return standpoint for investors, It's not as high yielding as some other sectors where you get private equity type 20% returns. But I think people understand that the downside is relatively limited as well.
Okay. If we just touch on M&A for a moment, there's been obviously the Nordic DAE deal, ALC, SMBC has been announced. It's kind of been a slow burn, onesie, twosie deals every year. Do you think that could accelerate? And maybe a related question, if I may, around the structured equity product that was used in that ALC, SMBC deal. Could we see more of that in the industry?
Sure. I do think there'll be more M&A. I think there'll be more consolidation in the sector. It makes sense. How AerCap has performed with their scale and size, I think there are others that would try to replicate that scale and size. Obviously, SMBC with Air Lease is now competing in that end of the market. So I think there will be consolidation. The structure that was particularly used on that transaction with Brookfield and Apollo providing the structured equity is very interesting. It's something that a lot of other infrastructure type funds as well as private credit type entities that have capital have been trying to deploy in the sector. So I think you'll see that used as a separate tool in certain situations as well.
And do you think that is there minimum ticket size for a product like that, or does it really depend on the quality of the assets?
Ticket size is an interesting question because I think there are players that can, for that structure, I think it'll be larger ticket sizes, to be perfectly honest. But I do think there are other forms of capital, even within sort of a private equity sort of complex, which can support smaller amounts as well.
Okay. You touched on the OEM, the 5,000 backlog of deliveries. How does that, as a banker, impact how you look at risk, your risk appetite, and how you look at structuring deals?
Well, I think it's a positive tailwind, right, to the industry in the sense that if you're financing existing aircraft, they're going to be in demand for a while. And so at the end of the day, we're lending against the aircraft with the servicer being involved in managing that. And I think what you're seeing already is that there's more comfort with mid-life aircraft than there was 10 years ago. If you go back to like 2012 to 15, mid-life aircraft were something that most people were gravitating away from. There was always yield there, but banks and alternative lenders, perhaps there weren't that many of them back then, everybody was gravitating towards the shinier new metal. Right now, you're seeing that over the last 2-3 years, people have gotten increasingly comfortable with mid-life assets, and it's fair because there's nothing wrong with a mid-life aircraft. With all the tests that the aircraft have to go through to fly, they're perfectly safe and perfectly fine. And you're extending the useful life of those aircraft. So, and you're seeing better credits, like the larger airlines continue to use mid-life aircraft because they're not getting the supply on the front end.
And what kind of assumptions are you guys thinking of when you think of when the supply issue might start to alleviate, when maybe more supply comes online, the OEMs start to maybe move a bit quicker?
I think when we look at that and just, we finance Boeing, we finance Airbus out of Europe, et cetera. So I think, most banks have lending relationships with the OEMs as well. It's going to take a few years for that to get back to, any level of balance. And I think, projecting out is we're sitting here in 2025. We don't see it happening anytime earlier than early 2030s. And so I think we feel pretty comfortable with lending to aircraft that are slightly older.
Okay, and maybe to talk
lending against aircraft that are slightly older.
Sure. If I just think about the interest rate environment generally, then kind of has gone up and down a little bit over the last number of years. But there's a sense here in New York this week that it's more stable, if there is such a thing with the interest rate environment. I'd be interested in the Mizuho perspective.
I think our economist, Steve Risciuto, thinks that rates are going to be higher for longer.
Okay.
But that's not necessarily what happens with the market. There is an overwhelming sense in the financial community that there will be increasing rate cuts, which is actually driving investors to buy as many debt instruments as they can, which is what's been driving spreads lower. And then when there are rate cuts, it's sort of, washes through.
Okay. Maybe to touch on, you mentioned there the unsecured bond market, right? And how accessible is that for lessors? And maybe a part of that question, how important is the IG rating?
So it is an important thing because the investment grade unsecured market is the deepest market in the world. The time when that really stands out is when you have a crisis. Issuers can always issue in the unsecured market in a crisis, maybe at a wider spread, whereas some other markets tend to shut down. So that is important. And there was a relatively large pricing differential between investment grade issuers and high yield issuers that are below investment grade. That's been historically anywhere between 250 to 300 basis points. In the last year or so, that's tightened to as much as 50 basis points. So there's not a whole lot of pricing differential. 50 basis points is still quite a lot, but it's not what it was before. I think that just shows that's particular to the aircraft lessor community. That just shows that the investor comfort with aircraft lessors has grown tremendously over the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, and maybe to focus on the IG point for a moment. Some people don't get there, and
Sure.
What are the reasons behind that? What are the challenges that maybe the smaller lessors have around getting to IG status?
So it depends on how you're organized as a company. Typically, you see the balance sheet lessors that have everything within the operating company get to investment grade quicker. There's also sponsorship, whether they're supported by a sovereign or a highly rated bank, etc. There's also management team expertise. There's years in his historical operations, and scale, which are all factors that the rating agencies take into consideration. That doesn't mean that somebody who's 2, 3, 4, 5 years old can't get to investment grade quicker, but those tend to be the considerations. There are other companies that are not investment grade that are perfectly fine, that can have higher leverage and produce potentially a greater return to their investors. So there's different strokes for different folks.
When guys do get there, the next step is an upgrade, right? So there has been some upgrades in the last year. Be interested in your perspective of whether there could be further upgrades in the next while.
It starts to get sticky after a certain point. So you get to investment grade, you get a triple B land, and then you start inching your way into single A minus. Historically, the reason why aircraft leasing companies have never gone higher is particularly because the rating agencies look at the airline community as largely below investment grade. So they don't want to allow the aircraft lessor to be notched a number of notches above where their client base is.
Yeah.
And since the client base is largely non-investment grade, they tend to not let you get too high within the investment grade spectrum, which is why it's been in the triple B low single A range.
Okay. Maybe pivoting for a moment to the kind of more traditional bank market. If you go back 4 or 5 years, there was definitely a sense, particularly amongst European banks, that was people exiting, Basel rules, etc., causing some challenges. What's your sense on the depth of the bank market today, and indeed are there some new players coming into that market?
There is tremendous support for the aircraft leasing community from the banking community today. Banks are, like I said earlier, increasingly comfortable with midlife assets. And you're finding banks lending against aviation from the Middle East, from Asia, on top of the traditional European banks and the US banks. There are obviously Basel considerations in Europe as well as ESG considerations in Europe. That's why you're seeing some of the smaller players like NordLB, more recently Hamburg Commercial, et cetera, that have exited the business. And that's driven more by the European ESG concerns than I would think Basel.
And is there any new financial products that you're seeing or that might come online to support lessors, or is it much?
Well, the alternative lenders, right?
Yeah.
So you're seeing a lot of alternative lenders like PK, like Wolofin, like Ashland Place, Halo with GA Telesis, Castle Lake's got a lending platform, Carlisle's got a lending platform, etc. Aviation Finance, that's a rather big one. They're all supporting and filling the gap that perhaps some of the smaller European lenders exiting the business has created. And I think they will be there to stay. I'm always wondering whether there's room for many players in that space. So I think some of the larger ones are always going to be fine, and some have differentiated strategies. But I do think there's a desire now for almost everyone to start a lending platform, and I wonder about whether at some point there's not enough room.
There's an upper cap.
Yeah.
We haven't really spoken about lease rate factors, but they have gone up significantly, and I assume help hugely with the banking case. I'd be interested in whether you're hearing any noise that actually they're at a level where the airlines might look at it a little bit differently, maybe look go back looking at export credit or supported product, or look at to borrow off their own balance sheet rather than lease?
The airlines do both, right? I mean, you've got some that will always lease, but a lot of the larger ones, like the U.S. carriers, always have their own balance sheet financing as well. We haven't seen much from a EETC issuance standpoint, although there may be some on the way. But the unsecured markets being strong, airlines also that are investment grade or high yield issue in the unsecured market. So it just tends to be a function of where their lower cost of capital is.
And do you think leasing is a percentage of the overall market at that kind of 50%-ish mark that sometimes thrown out there is kind of where it's going to stay, or do you see it moving much?
I think it could be as high as 60%, but at some level it probably caps out.
Okay. You guys are obviously knee deep in the ABS market. Really interested in your perspective on the role that plays, both for lessors and as part of maybe that bringing capital into the sector.
Sure. So the ABS market is about $380 billion of issuance a year. The best years that the aircraft leasing ABS issuances have been is about $9.6 billion in 2019 and 2021. We're actually $7.2 billion today. That's as of today, and I think that'll get to the mid $8 billions very soon. And there's other deals on the way, so we could easily exceed the 9.6 from 19 and 21. And there has been no E-note issuances this year, so it's just purely debt. And that could be on the come in the future. But I think you have to think about the large investment grade aircraft lessors. They finance themselves with unsecured debt. They typically use the ABS market as a managed vehicle where they can dispose assets into a structure, which is then financed by a third-party equity source with ABS debt. So the investment grade lessors typically use the ABS market for managed assets. And then you've got the fund type asset managers like a BBAM, a Carlyle, a Castle Lake, et cetera, who actually rely on the ABS market for primary financing.
And do you think some of these structures have been set up where there's been issuances of A but no B, but it's set up to do B and set up to do a C? Do you think that could happen the next number of months, that people go back and reissue? Yeah,
we've seen A's, B's, C's issued. We've seen people issue as A's and retain B's and C's. I think it's just a function of where the pricing has been. People sometimes don't want to, accept a wider pricing because of certain market conditions on that particular day. Or the wider pricing may not be a spread issue; it may be a rate issue because the rate's, backed up on a particular day. So, I think I do think that most of the time the reason why there's not a B or C issuance is because the collateral does not produce enough cash flow to service a B or a C. So sometimes you structure it in there, and then when your collateral pool matures and is higher yielding, maybe you issue it at that point. We always recommend you structure it in upfront because it's just difficult to structure it later.
Okay. You mentioned E-notes earlier. We haven't seen a primary issuance, certainly in the aircraft ABS market. What do you think would need to happen for there to be a primary issuance? Is it market conditions, or will there need to be some sort of innovation to how that product is structured?
So I think it's driven mainly by the cash flows produced by the collateral. So you've had a period where lease rates were not they were increasing, but at a slow rate. Now you're getting to a point where they've gone up a fair bit from 2022. You've also seen the interest rates in the market come down. As long as that's in balance, you should have enough cash in order to service an A note, a B note, potentially a C note, and equity to create a return for the equity. That tends to be more midlife assets. On the front end, on brand new aircraft with good credits, you tend to not have lease rate factors that can support that.
Yeah.
So I think you will see E-note issuances. There have been E-notes done in container leasing and equipment that we've done. So the investor base is there. Within aviation, I think everybody gravitated to senior debt when the rates went up in 2022. Now that's all been exhausted, so they're looking for length in terms of tenor, as well as a yield in terms of like subordinate debt or equity. Okay. So I think it's just a matter of time before you see that. It's likely to be a single buyer rather than a tradable equity type note.
Okay, and there was lots of ABSs pre-COVID, and lots of those will be coming up to refinancing in the next couple of years. One, do you think there will be secondary trading in the E-notes of those structures, or will some look to reissue, or will some just cash it out?
So there has been secondary trading, definitely. But I think most likely, given the demand for aircraft among the leasing community, the best valuation that these equity positions are going to, generate is probably through a sale of assets, whether it's a portfolio sale to another lessor or a sale of aircraft to multiple lessors. I think the E-notes from those deals would recover the most value from that process rather than trading the position itself.
Okay. There's a lot of talk in the US this week about the Spirit bankruptcy, just to pivot for a moment, and be interested in how you as a banker think about that, right, and think about the impact of airline bankruptcies. I suppose in one sense in aircraft leasing there's always bankruptcies and lessors are pretty skilled in dealing with that. Is there any particular region, business model on the airline side that when you look at lessors maybe raise a concern for you around how you manage risk in the lessor model?
Yeah, we do look at how diversified the lessors' portfolios are. We look at how experienced they are in recoveries, which jurisdictions they've recovered assets from, how their risk tolerance is over historical periods where there's been regions of the world where there's been crisis. But probably the biggest deterrent we have is that we primarily finance aircraft lessors. There's very few airlines that we finance directly. And so we've taken the approach that, they're the experts at it. We'll finance them. They know what they're doing.
Okay. If I touch on a topic that probably is taking a very firm backseat in 2024 and 25, ESG, and very much here in North America has taken a backseat. Do you think that's just where we are now, that it's not going to come back as a primary consideration? Or even are there elements of the market like maybe European banks who still need to factor into their underwriting considerations?
I think Europe's been far ahead of everyone with regards to ESG considerations, and they've been really imposing a lot of practical restrictions as well as financing, requirements. But it has never quite become an issue in the U.S. There's been green bond issuances and ESG KPI, structures that have been put in place. But the pricing on those structures have been marginally beneficial. So there hasn't been really a big pricing differential. And ultimately, issuers are going to, try to do things where they can price better. So if imposing all those restrictions are not going to create a big pricing benefit, they're likely not to. So it hasn't been a big mover in the U.S., even, over the last 4 or 5 years.
And do you get any sense that maybe there might be some players who'll be locked out of deals, so to turn it around, that won't be allowed to participate in aviation deals, either on the bank side or maybe investor side because of ESG considerations around aviation?
Well, like I said, the European banks, I think, have those restrictions already.
Yeah.
We're not seeing it have an impact in the investor community yet.
Okay. If I kind of try and bring all that together, Vinodh, I'd be interested in your sense on 2026, right? So, what are your optimism levels like? What kind of year do you think is going to be for the aircraft leasing community? And if you were thinking of risks, what's top of mind from a risk perspective?
So I think I'm cautiously optimistic. You would think that given that we're at the start of a long cycle again and with the supply issues that the sector should be in good shape. I do worry about geopolitical risk with the wars in different parts of the world and, governments getting, governments changing around the world and taking different approaches, policies changing dramatically. So I think that's probably the biggest concern I would have on that front.
Okay. Well, Vinodh, thank you for your insights. I think our viewers will find lots in there, right, of real interest. And continuing success to you and the credit team in Mizuho.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it very much. And thank you to KPMG and Airline Economics.